Hello everyone and welcome to our knowledge transfer session. Today we're going to be talking about commissions.
I actually think you mean to say compensation.
You meant to say that.
I meant to say that, right?
We'll talk about more of that in a moment.
So we're talking about this in the real estate industry, and it's funny because we've had a lot of conversations before we can even make this knowledge transfer video about what the heck are you guys be allowed to say, right? I'm very familiar with how compliance works. I'm very familiar with, like, you have to do things a certain way or you lose your job, right? It's very much it's very rarely not black or white, right? So I respect that there's a lot of, like, spine stiffening here. Let's try and get through this. We're going to talk this around buyer's compensation because that's a big topic.
Yeah, for sure.
Around a lawsuit that happened recently, right?
A federal lawsuit that happened. So the Department of Justice ended up filing a lawsuit against National Association of Realtors and numerous real estate brokerages. And it was a big deal. We're not going to get into the crux of all of that. We don't want to put you to sleep. But it did enact some big changes across the industry. And we're happy to say, state of Washington kind of saw the writing on the wall a number of years ago. I think it was like 2019.
Yeah, 5 years ago.
5 years ago. They started putting, our attorneys here started putting some things into place that were looked upon a little rudely by the rest of the country, going, what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
And now we're having everybody do it. So it's, we've been fortunate here in the state of Washington that we've been working on this practice for a while, but huge changes, one of which is compensation over commission.
And I believe there's like 14 states now around the country who are copying what we've been doing or had already started that prior to this most recent set of lawsuits. So it's been recognized that what we've been doing for the last few years has been working quite well.
Well, and before we get going, we'll introduce ourselves basically.
I guess we probably should.
Yeah, so you're my friends at Sound Team Realty. I like how to say that, right?
Yeah, we like the friends part for sure.
The friends part, yeah. Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Fletch. We're based out of North Seattle, and I live in Issaquah for the last long time.
I'm Jesse. Sound Team Realty, been with RE/MAX Northwest for 20 plus years now, which is just crazy.
I know. You don't have enough gray hairs in your head for that one.
I have them all right here. We've got the right lighting.
And I'm John Erickson. I run a retirement program here in Bellevue, Washington, next to Overlake Hospital. And I love creating these knowledge videos for you all so you can kind of learn a little bit about this industry as a whole, right?
Well,
you need to take that light with you.
Yeah, I do. It really does. The industry, for the longest time, real estate brokers were the guardians of information. And what we've seen, I know, shocker, before computers, you would hate that time. You're so young.
Is that before cell phones?
Yes, yeah. And when dinosaurs were roaming the earth, there was a big book with all of the information about what homes were for sale and all that. And real estate brokers were the keeper of this information. Well, fast forward.
And that was mostly really that, and opening the occasional door was mostly what they did.
Yeah.
Did you have to wear like wizard's robes and stay in dark places?
Yes, yeah. Call myself Gandalf.
Right.
I knew you'd like that one.
I did.
So now here we are. Listings can be found online. All of this information can be found online. So there's a lot of different things that have changed throughout the industry. So we're not surprised to be seeing this most recent change that was really predicated by the Department of Justice and their lawsuit against NAR and these other big brokerages. One of the biggest things that we are seeing right now is buyer's agency agreements.
Okay, well, before we go on that, let's talk about, so we talk about buyer's agency agreements. Can you describe what a more traditional compensation model would have been historically, and then we can go to the buyer's agency agreements? Like, how did it work before this?
Historically, it has all been taken care of by the seller.
Okay.
So the seller is going to put their house on the market, and they're going to employ, in most cases, a seller's broker, a listing broker. And when they fill out all their paperwork, which has always been done, they decide then and there how much money not only is the seller's broker going to make, but also the buyer's broker. And the sellers will pay the buyer's broker out of the seller's proceeds. And typically that's been how it's been done. Most of the time that's been roughly 3% aside, so about 6%. And that's been a traditional thing that's kind of worked for a long time. The argument is certainly easily made that the prices of the houses were inflated by that amount to where it really doesn't hurt the seller. Everybody's facilitating the purchase and the sale, and the seller makes what they make in the end. And that's worked quite well for a long time until now.
And I would also include that was a small portion of the real estate time before a buyer was able to have their own buyer's representation. The seller was represented by the listing broker, and anybody that was bringing in a buyer was actually anybody being any real estate agent at that time that was bringing in a buyer was still a representative of the seller. We're not going to go too much into that just because there's just so much that has to be unraveled there. So this whole change now really is a lot about a seller being represented by a listing broker if they choose, and a buyer being represented by a buyer's broker if they choose, and what that all means.
And who pays for which.
Yes.
And so buyer's broker's compensation is going to probably be the maybe harder area to understand, the more squishy area, because sellers might start saying, I don't want to pay the buyer's broker's compensation anymore, right?
Which is where the lawsuit came from in the first place.
And we actually started seeing some sellers who said, I am not going to pay a buyer's broker compensation.
In the last couple of years?
Yeah, even before 2019, well before. They wanted to pay the listing broker. So we've seen it. The reality is that here in Washington, a seller was able to negotiate or had the right to negotiate how much they paid the listing broker and how much they paid the buyer's broker. Now, whether or not that was communicated properly to the seller, we can't talk on that because we know that probably wasn't happening
when we talk about
as often.
A wide variety of sales across the entire state, right?
Styles,
different brokerages.
Which brokers knew what they were doing better than others, comfortable enough to explain the details.
I think we could say on both sides of the equation, you could have some good positive ones and some clearly negative ones.
Right? Always, in every industry, but especially, so. So, go ahead.
So now we got buyer's compensation, right? It's something that's going to slowly but surely, due to tradition, going to be unpacked potentially, right?
It is.
And because as people understand that they can ask for this more and they want to fight over this point, and we get to the emotions of buying and selling a home, we could run into this problem. Let me see if I can explain this correctly. And you, once again, correct me where I'm wrong. You're usually pretty good at this. So I go and I find the dream house.
Are you the buyer?
I'm the buyer, and I want you guys to represent me as the buyer. Okay?
Yeah.
And I now have probably signed a contract with you for that representation.
100% you have. That is a legal requirement in the
law.
state of Washington that if you want us to represent you to go even look at a house.
Okay.
Now, we're allowed to go look at one house.
First one's free.
Yeah, and then in a reasonable amount of time, we have to make sure that we have you as our buyer client under contract as a buyer's agency agreement, with a buyer's agency agreement.
It's effectively, the words we prefer to use is a buyer's representation agreement.
Right.
The actual word is the buyer's agency agreement, but it's just a representation thing. And for us, it's not been a difficult transition because nobody has ever worked with us that didn't want to. It's always a voluntary thing. So, okay, yes, we're all now, and this is nationwide laws. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's passed nationwide. And then individual states have done things differently. So if you're watching this out of the state, some of this might sound really wacko, like we don't know what we're talking about. We're talking very specifically about Washington State.
Yep.
And when over the last, especially 6 months since this has really started to shake out, I've pretty much just quit reading about the other areas because it gets confusing. Yeah. And just focus on what we're doing because what we're doing isn't what everybody else is doing. So the buyer's representation agreement, the buyer's agency agreement is something that now every single licensed realtor who's ever going to work with a buyer has to have signed. You cannot have a buyer's like, I don't need that. No, you're right. I'll work with you, no problem otherwise. Because you'll lose your license as well as not get paid on the transaction that you're working with. Okay. So it's now an absolute utter given. And how that is put into practice, the stories that are told, how people are producing these things, I'm sure varies like the leaves on the trees. But certainly with us, it's an easy thing because it's just what we do. Anybody wants out, no problem.
Right, and so of course you're not So I guess that gets two basic questions, right? One is okay, so I'm hiring you as my buyer's broker. you want to be paid, right? I can't just like
Absolutely.
give you
It's our
preference.
some crackers and sing you a song.
Yeah,
you want
exactly.
Actual money.
Yeah.
Right?
Really good song.
Right. I'm a good singer.
License it.
Right. So that has to be communicated in the agreement somehow, right? You're going to get paid, and it's probably going to be some percentage of the sale price.
And
right?
we're not going to talk specifics on
Sure.
percentage. We're not going to talk any specifics on numbers.
Right.
We'll talk about the generalities of and the specifics of the contract, but we won't talk about the specifics of the numbers.
Yeah. So you're going to commit to some number of
Right.
compensation, right?
Yep.
And then. And you don't know if the seller's going to pay that compensation, so now you have to come out with that money. And let's say it's significant, right? I mean, let's say it's
real money.
Yeah.
So let's maybe to make this a little bit easier, let's use something other than money. Let's
Okay.
use pieces of chocolate, for
I
example.
love pieces of
Okay.
chocolate. This is what we call
So,
legal wrangling
That's
around
exactly
language.
right. So let's say you hired us
Right.
to represent you to go purchase this property over here. We don't know when we first get into contract with you how many pieces of chocolate that seller is going to be offering to the buyer's
Right.
broker,
If
right?
any.
If any, right? They could be. It is their right to not offer any. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation with you, and we're going to say, here's how many pieces of chocolate we charge to help you purchase a home.
And that is in that buyer's representation, buyer's agency.
Let's
agreement.
say 5 pieces of chocolate for that.
Okay.
Okay. You sign it. You're like, okay, I get it. Or you understand it. We go look at the house. You're like, this is the house that we want to purchase. Now, one of the things that's different in the state of Washington than around almost all the rest of the country is we have access to how many pieces of chocolate that seller is offering, if any, to us as the buyer's brokers.
Most of the time now.
Most of the
they
time.
can still say put it in the offer, which
Yeah, that's
makes
true.
it nebulous
Negotiation
again,
change.
Yeah,
change.
exactly.
Yes.
So if that seller is saying, hey, I am offering 5 pieces of chocolate to a buyer's broker who brings in a buyer and successfully closes, then our contract states we are even.
Right. 5 and 5.
You don't bring any pieces of chocolate in
Right.
at that particular point. Now, if that seller says, I am offering 1 piece of chocolate,
Okay.
we now have a delta of 4.
Right.
Right? So what that contract allows us to do is negotiate on your behalf to say, sellers, we have a contract that with our buyer that offers us 5 pieces of chocolate. We would like you to contribute the additional 4 pieces of chocolate. So we still have an opportunity to go out and say, and try to get the seller to pay 5 pieces of chocolate. If they come back and say no, and we come back to you and say, John, they're saying no. So that means not only will you have to purchase that home, but you will also have to make up the difference of pieces of chocolate. So you would have to make up the 4 pieces of chocolate.
So it goes into your overall cost of the house.
Yeah.
So you're going to have your down payment, and you're going to have your earnest money, and you're going to have your compensation that you
Your
pay
4 pieces
your
of
buyer's
chocolate.
broker.
Yep,
In this
yep.
case, 4 pieces of chocolate.
All right, and we don't know because once again, 4 pieces of chocolate could be a significant sum of money once
Right.
I've done everything else, right?
Yep.
Like, I remember I bought my first house. I had my emergency fund. I had the money I put in there. That was what I had. Like I didn't have
Sure.
extra.
Absolutely.
Pieces of chocolate,
Sure.
right? So then, how's the industry going to react to that? Like, or is there going to be? I guess it could be able to roll into loans. Do we have that yet?
The industry's reacted from A to Z.
Okay.
You've got a whole lot of people thinking the sky's falling. You've got a bunch of people who aren't necessarily comfortable in their own jobs.
Right.
And-
Are you
and-
competent?
Yeah,
Yeah.
And being able to convey what they're worth,
Right.
who are largely getting out of the industry.
Right.
Not a bad thing in the big picture. And then kind of everything in between. So it really just it depends on individuals, depends on the working relationships that you have, and if you have people that are worth the effort.
The chocolate piece has not been rolled into the loans as of yet.
Okay.
So I know
Lenders
that
are not yet prepared for
yeah,
that.
the lending institution is still working on that. We have seen some changes though. One of the big changes we've seen is that VA loans, for example, in the past would not allow a buyer to pay their buyer's broker any pieces of chocolate. Because of these changes across the country, the VA loan has come out, or the VA has come out and said, okay, yes, we understand that if a VA buyer wants to purchase a home and the seller is offering no chocolate, the VA buyer is able to pay their buyer's broker. Now, what we're really doing though is we are seeing that there is some more transparency to this whole thing, because the buyers in the past didn't always get communicated with about how they were paid. I remember when I first started, I was coached, well, you just tell that buyer that they don't pay you anything. It's just the seller. Right? And that was, in hindsight.
Sales coaching.
I don't love that in hindsight, because that wasn't true transparency.
It's not the full truth.
So is there more transparency that can come? Absolutely. But what this buyer's representation, buyer's agency agreement does is it says, John, if you want to work with us, here's how much we get paid in chocolate, and here's how it all works, how it all goes down, and you have the opportunity to negotiate on that if you'd like, or sign it, or say, no, you know what, I'm going to go do this on my own. Whatever you want, but at least you now have more
Or
knowledge.
we'll go find a different house where this is not the scenario
That absolutely
that we're
could be the
interested in.
case. Yeah.
All right, so last little bullet point, and then we'll wrap this one up. So, things can go sideways on this, right? Where, there could be a lot of hurt feelings on this, on the back end of this, right? Has there been, could buyers walk away from you guys? Be like, oh, I don't want to use you guys. I want this house, right? I mean, is that even doable?
So that's a great question. And
it's a hard one, right?
I will answer it this way. Each broker has their right to do with that scenario how they want. And, if we've been working together for 3 years and Fletch and I have taken you out to look at 10 houses a weekend.
Right. You've spent real money on this situation
We've
yourself.
spent some real money on this, and you say, you know what, guys, this is the house I want. I can't pay you. We're going to have a hard conversation. Now, it is because you are contractually obligated based on the buyer's agency agreement, and you go out and buy that house, a brokerage might come and say, you owe us 4 pieces of chocolate.
Right.
But that isn't necessarily,
Uniform.
definitely not uniform, and not necessarily how some of us do our business.
Yeah.
That's fair. Well, this is great. I mean, I know this is a really hard conversation.
It is.
I'm glad you corrected me. It's not commission, it's compensation.
Yep.
And we're
Right.
just trying to keep it somewhat
Yeah,
within
yeah,
the rails,
yeah,
because
yeah.
there's just so many turns.
Well, and getting a broker's perspective in this situation has been important, because if you look at the media, they're telling you the stories, what's going on.
Of course.
They don't have necessarily the in-depth look at this. So I thought it was really good to have you here to talk about it.
And importantly, if you're reading the New York Times, for example, they don't have
Yes.
anything to do with what goes on here.
Right.
And there are some local newspapers that have written about real estate for years and years and years that you wonder if they understand what goes on in the real estate
of
market
course.
here.
Yeah.
So, but yes, national media, the next state over, those don't necessarily have anything to do with us, which makes it a little bit confusing.
What we do know, though, is there's still lots of questions. So if you have questions,
Yeah.
we're happy to answer any questions. We're happy to go over the contract. Even if you decide that you want to work with somebody else, we're still here as a resource.
Yeah, just explain things.
And to explain things. We're all learning this together. We've gone through a lot of classes, and we're going to continue to go through classes.
And I can tell, we've talked to the behind the scenes on this. I can tell that you're charging hard at this, and you're like, oh man, there's a lot of change at the same time, right?
Well, you notice the spine
Mine's
stiffening.
stepping up.
There's
You're like,
a lot of
proper.
that, so.
We're talking about pieces of chocolate today.
That's right.
You can exhale soon.
Right. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I know this is another good video. Once again, I'm John Erickson. I run a retirement practice here in Bellevue, next to our Lake Hospital. And if you ever have questions in the financial services industry, I'm happy here to talk to you and help you out however I can.
Jesse Paulson with Sound Team Realty, Remax Northwest. Anything we can do to help, just let us know.
And I'm Fletch, also Sound Team Realty. We actually love this stuff. This is what we have chosen to do because we love it. So if we can help, let us know. It's fun stuff for us.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye now.